Again, you're one of the best communicators that I've ever listened to. If I could be half as good at you, or at communicating as you are, I would be set. How can I teach myself to do that?
This question was asked of the infamous Dr. Jordan Peterson. Love him or hate him, your opinion of him, if you're familiar with him, is probably built around his political opinions. It's not built around his speaking abilities. And the reality is, Dr. Jordan Peterson is an excellent communicator, and he's an excellent speaker, and there's things we can learn from him, even if we disagree with his political stances. So, in just a second, I'm going to show you what his answer to this question was. Before I do that, I want to tell you why I picked this question, why this is the topic we're talking about today, because honestly, I think communication is so vitally important, and when we talk about it, we are talking about something that is fundamentally religious in nature. In my last video, I asked an AI to tell me what the logos is. And when we talk about communication, we are talking about the logos. What is logos? Well, logos is fundamentally this concept of pure rationality. It encapsulates who you are, how you think, how the universe operates. It's a massive concept. All of these things are not even a valid description of what the logos is. For more in-depth conversation on what the logos is, there's a link in the description to the video I made on this topic. I'm going to suggest to you that there's no more valuable skill that you can learn in this life than to well articulate your thoughts. To be able to communicate effectively with other human beings is the most valuable skill you will ever acquire. I'm sure you're familiar with this expression that the pen is mightier than the sword. That's what we're talking about right now. The reality is, if you know how to communicate and you know how to read people, you will be able to manifest the reality that you choose in this world. There's nothing more valuable for you than to be able to have an idea, to fully understand the idea, and to be able to communicate that idea with others in a way that they fully understand it. So when this student asks Dr. Jordan Peterson, how can I communicate better? What he's really asking is, how can I manifest the reality that I want? And we all know that inherently. That's why we actually care about questions like this. Whether or not we are willing to actually go seek out the answers, we recognize that it would be better for us if we could communicate better, because we inherently understand that that is how we manifest the reality that we want to see in the world. Which actually makes perfect sense when you think about it, since the logos translates to the word in 1 John, and God speaks creation into reality. When we think about the Christian framework of us being made in God's image, what we're really talking about is that we are substantiations, at least in part, of the logos, of the word. It's not surprising that this is the single most valuable thing in all of nature. So let's see what Dr. Jordan Peterson has to say about improving your communication skills.
Practice. Really, well, there's a couple of things. It helps to read a lot. It really helps to write.
So there you have it. The answer is pretty simple. All we need to do is practice. All we need to do is actually start playing with our thoughts. And a couple easy ways that we can do that are to actually practice having conversations, to read more, and to write more. The more that we can write, the more that we can practice putting our thoughts onto paper, the more articulate we will naturally become.
So if you want to make yourself articulate, which is a very good idea, then not only should you read, but you should write down what you think.
The more practice we get with interacting with hard concepts, with heady ideas, the better we understand them, the better we see how they work, the more easily we can communicate. The other piece of advice that I'd give to anybody who's trying to learn how to better communicate is to actually practice communicating, have more conversations with people. And personally, I would recommend having one-on-one conversations and really paying attention to social cues, paying attention to their framework, how their hands are, the tone in their voice. Pay attention to all the things that are not actually the words that they're saying. And as another general rule, try to listen more than you speak.
If you're going to speak effectively, you have to know way more than you're talking about. So this is often difficult for beginning lecturers at university, because they'll do a lecture on a topic, but they only know as much as they're saying in the lecture. And they get kind of stuck to their notes because of it.
That's actually a philosophy that I live out in the Defenders Academy. Everything that I'm doing with this ministry is an embodiment of the idea of know more than you're going to speak on. My goal with any argument that I come across is to know more about that argument than the person who's going to make it. We call that steelmanning. So as an example, when somebody tells me that they don't believe in God because they believe in science, well, one thing that I should be able to do if I really want to have an in-depth conversation with this person is know more about the specific topics in science that are likely to come up than they do. So maybe that means that I have studied evolutionary theory more than they have, because maybe that's the field that persuades them. Maybe they don't actually have a specific thing, so what I need to know more about is actually the philosophy of science. So maybe I'll show them a series of examples where we can point out that science cannot enter this field. There's a lot of things that the study of science is completely incapable of discussing, and that's not a diss on science, that's just recognizing that different fields of study do different things. Similarly, when I had friends who were coming to me on a regular basis who adhered to Mormon doctrine, I studied the Mormon doctrines. I learned as much as I possibly could about it, knowing that the majority of it would never enter our discussions, but wanting to know why they were saying what they were saying, what was going on in their head, and if something specific does come up, wanting to know where I stood on it and why I stood there on it. As a side note, the doctrine of Mormonism is the most obviously false doctrine of any religion that I've ever studied. And in a very real sense, that's why we study as much as we do, so that we can be prepared for anything that's necessary to help the person who's in front of us as much as we possibly can. In order to do that, we need to understand where they're coming from, we need to understand what they think, why they think it, and ideally we want to be able to steelman their argument, to give a better defense of their perspective than they can give themselves. Once you can do that, you understand it well enough to really be able to dig into the heart of the problem and be as effective of a communicator as possible.
Don't deliver a talk to an audience. That's a really bad way of thinking about it. You're actually engaged in a conversation with an audience. Even if they're not talking, they're nodding and shifting position and, looking like this, and you can pull all that in and use it to govern the level at which you're addressing the entire audience.
I was having a conversation about this with my wife last night, and I contend that in a healthy conversation, both parties are equally responsible for the conversation. I actually think of it kind of like this metaphor. A conversation is very much like a child, in that both parties are equally responsible for it being there. However, the conversation is going to live its own life. It's going to grow, and maybe it's going to grow in directions that you didn't want it to grow or that you didn't expect it to grow. And then it's going to change, and it's going to morph, and it's going to evolve, and then eventually the conversation is going to die, and that's just the cycle of life, and that's the cycle of conversations. But the reality is, no individual is fully responsible for the conversation that's had, but both individuals hold equal responsibility for said conversation, as long as it's a healthy conversation. And to me, that's what Jordan Peterson is hitting on here when he's talking about the dynamic between the audience and the speaker, because you might think that a healthy conversation isn't 50-50 when you consider that it's very possible that in a healthy conversation, one person's talking more. However, talking is a tiny portion of a conversation. There's all the nonverbals, there's the tone, there's the posture, there's everything else that goes into it that tells me whether or not I should keep going. And as long as I'm paying attention to those social cues, you're just as involved in this conversation as I am, even if I'm the one doing the majority of the talking.
There isn't anything that you can possibly do that makes you more competent in everything you do than to learn how to communicate. I don't care if you're going to be a carpenter. I mean, being a carpenter, by the way, is very difficult, especially if you're a good carpenter. But if you're good at communicating as a carpenter, you're like 10 times better as a carpenter. The people that I've watched in my life who've been spectacularly successful they have skills. Clearly, that's a minimum precondition. But they're also very, very good at articulating themselves. And so whenever they negotiate, they're successful.
I don't have anything else to say to that. Dr. Jordan Peterson ended the same way that I started. Communication is the single most valuable skill you can ever learn. Hey, if you appreciated this video, then I'm gonna invite you to prayerfully consider supporting us on Patreon so you can get more exclusive content like this, and we can keep making content like this on our YouTube channel as well. Everything that we do and are able to do is thanks to the support of patrons like you, and anything that you can do, whether it's $3 a month or whatever it may be, is helpful, and it goes a long way towards helping our ministry, towards helping more people learn the truth of Jesus Christ and the evidence for that truth. So I invite you to prayerfully consider supporting us in that way. Love y'all. God bless. And I really need a haircut. It's just not gonna look good.